Hey, this is Danny the Count Coker. Hey, this is comedian, author, and most importantly, vintage race car driver Adam Carolla.
Hi, this is Shirley Cha-Cha Muldowney.
I'm John Forrest.
Hey, this is Jack Roush.
And you're listening to Nostalgic Radio and Cars.
That's Nostalgic Radio and Cars with the most fascinating and legendary names in motorsports every Tuesday from 7 to 8 p.m. right here on the Tan Talk Radio Network.
Hey, did you know there's a live psychology talk show Thursday and Friday at noon where you can call in and get free guidance and also learn several different topics relating to ending the stigma of mental health? It's called Moments of Clarity on WTAN 1340 AM. It's with licensed therapist Tiffany Warner, who will try to end the stigma of mental health. But the only way you can do that is to listen to Moments of Clarity Thursday and Friday at noon on WTAN 1340 AM, the Tan Talk Radio Network.
Hi, this is Paul Malloy, host of Freedom Works, The Paul Malloy Show. I hope you'll join every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 10 to 11 a.m. Eastern Time, here on the Tan Talk Radio Network, where we strive to bring you the libertarian perspective on political events of the day. There's no show quite like Freedom Works, with in-depth interviews, our ultimate top 10 list, and so much more. So join us for Freedom Works, The Paul Malloy Show, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 10 to 11 a.m. here on the Tan Talk Radio Network.
Don't turn it off now. You need this stuff. Tampa Bay's Tan Talk Radio Network.
Afghanistan, gasoline prices, inflation, all Biden's fault, right? Not necessarily. We'll explain right now on The Voice of Reason.
You are about to enter the arena of real news and factual commentary on The Voice of Reason here on the Tan Talk Radio Network. Now, here are your hosts for today's program, Ed Golly and Joe Reinhardt.
Before we get to that, I wanted to mention, Joe, that hurricane season starts this weekend, approximately. Now, meteorologists are not very bright people. The fact that's probably why they're meteorologists. They can be wrong all the time. They don't get fired. That's the old joke. But they for some reason think they can select an arbitrary date on the calendar, and that's when hurricanes will start forming. But for the past, 7 or 8 years, most of those years have just seen tropical storms.
Already a named storm.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I was looking. I didn't see it. There you go. So they haven't got it. They think the problem is the hurricane can't read the calendar, but the real problem is the meteorologist can't read the calendar. So for those of you who live here in Florida, what I recommend is that you start thinking about maybe every time you go to the market, look for something that you can buy that would compose a meal for you without needing to be cooked or heated or refrigerated, so that if you lose power or prepackaged fish that's pre-cooked, don't worry if it tastes good. You just want to eat for a few days until the power comes back on, right? And get ahead of the curve so that if a storm is coming, you're not caught in the rush or looking around at bare shelves in the grocery store. And maybe a few containers for some fresh water to keep, so that if you have a water issue, you'll have drinkable water. So go ahead and drink city water for a week. Geez, we did it all the time. We didn't have bottled water when we were kids. We turned on the faucet and drank the water. You can actually do that and survive.
The idea of paying for water is laughable, really.
And also, don't forget, maybe a battery-powered radio.
Oh, and don't forget that Evian, which is a very popular brand of water, is naive spelled backwards.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah. So get a few containers that you can use to store water.
Fill the bathtub.
Just keep them, yeah. Well,
some of the cleanest water in the house, because it sits there and it's been filtered, is the water that sits in your toilet tank,
right.
Not the bowl, the tank.
But even, I understand even what's in the bowl is okay because it's flushed through, so the dog doesn't kill himself drinking out of it.
It's still better than dying of thirst.
Yeah, it is. Any storm in a port, right?
Right.
So anyway, forget what the meteorologists tell you. They'll catch up in a few years, I'm sure, but they haven't yet, and so we're ahead of the curve here.
All they know is where the wind is coming from. They have no idea where it's going.
And that idea about planting nuclear detonations in the middle of the storms, that's not going to work. Break them up.
Well, we don't know till we try.
But what is the energy source of a hurricane? It's heat, right? And just make it worse, wouldn't it?
Well, yes, but at least we would have added radioactivity
To the problem.
to the process, and so now it's a little extra benefit.
Well, yeah. Then if your lights are out at night, you still might glow just naturally from the radio.
Right. Plus, you've got all this troublesome hair.
And a quick correction from this morning show, Tim mentioned that voting is a privilege, not a right. Well, that's not quite right, because Amendment 15 of the Constitution of this country says this: the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2 of that says the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, that was ratified in 1870.
Yes, but it lists several examples of why you can't abridge people's right to vote. But what it doesn't say is for any other reason, which leaves open the idea that if it's not specifically forbidden, well, then we certainly can do it. This is a rather recent development, as we know.
Right. So it doesn't say by virtue of being female, you can vote.
Female,
because they
black,
couldn't vote for another-
left-handed, short, you just don't look enough like me. That's reason enough to not be allowed to vote, I think.
The spirit of it, though, is that every citizen
the
has a
spirit
right to
of it.
vote, and that's because the citizens theoretically run the government.
Right.
It's our government, so we have the right to participate in deciding who runs it. Now, of course, our governor doesn't think that way. He thinks if you're prone to vote Democratic, you're not going to be able to vote, and he tells the felons they can't vote because they owe money. But what if you're behind on your taxes? I sent my tax payment to the IRS on about February 4th, 2021. So the CPA made out the return. He filed it electronically. He gave me a coupon and an envelope, says put the check in the envelope, mail it in. It still hasn't cleared. We've never seen the check again. So the IRS says I owe them last year's payment, even though I sent it in. Should I be able to vote since I owe the government money, even though I paid it?
Even though you never voted before anyway.
Right. So this is just Jim Crow, which of course continued to exist all the way up until a Democratic president signed the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act in the mid-'60s.
Curbing the rights of Democrats and felons, who are mostly Democrats, to vote is kind of unnecessary. It's overkill, because if you listen to the Republicans closely, particularly the Republican broadcasters, you must conclude that most of the Democrats are too slow-witted to find their way to the polling booth or the street corner. In any case, so they're in no danger of voting, even if they knew how.
Let's talk about these issues that Biden's getting all the blame for.
Yes.
Without much suggestion for how he should resolve it, starting with Afghanistan. That really put a black mark on
Donald Trump caused that. That's his fault.
Well, he did negotiate the withdrawal. And the only thing I fault him for is he didn't do it 2 years earlier, but he negotiated a withdrawal, and wisely so, because we'd been there 20 years, longest war we'd ever been in. And he said it's time to get out, and he was right.
The place where empires go to die. Right.
And he said it for March of 2021. And so
should we take 1 second here and cut away and ask Big Ed to explain to our listeners why they can't get us on YouTube and how to access it? I forgot to mention
with
that.
me, Big Ed.
Ed, help us.
For you, Joe, it's Trump's fault.
That we can't get on YouTube?
That's the
I believe
extent
it.
of your vocabulary, by the way. Trump's fault. You didn't come on time. Trump's fault. You can if they go to YouTube and search in the box here, Voice of Reason and today's date, it'll come up.
Okay.
It's just on my channel instead of the Tan Talk channel, but it'll come up.
Voice of Reason and today's
There's
date.
people on there right now.
Okay.
I'll be damned.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you, Ed.
Make sure to put the show in today's date.
Thanks for everything.
Well, anyway, Biden, I presume, and I think it's a given, that he followed the advice of the people who were mixed up in this, military experts, State Department people, intelligence agencies, who told him that we had supplied so much hardware and training for the Afghanistan military that they would be able to protect the major cities that were clear of Taliban, and then eventually expand out into the country until the Taliban gets shoved into some remote corner of the country and then just fizzles out. And I think
just along the lines of the South Vietnamese were able to fend for themselves when we pulled out.
Yeah, and so he
For about an hour.
honored the previous administration's deal to pull out and did. I think that though nobody anticipated that the Afghanistan military was so inept and would just simply drop all their weapons, take off their uniforms, go home and hide under the bed. The U.S. left behind more than $7 billion in military equipment. That's just what we left behind. That's not what had been used over there. 23,825 Humvees.
Wow.
Nearly 900 combat vehicles. 250,000 automatic rifles. We could use some of those over here, couldn't we? We don't have enough guns over here yet.
Yeah. Right.
95 drones and over 1 million mortar
It's
rounds.
back to school.
So it's not like we left these guys empty-handed, right? And don't forget all those attack helicopters we saw that they were breaking up and destroying so they couldn't be used, right? And what did their president do? Did he stand and put up a fight against the Taliban? He was the first guy to leave with $163 million of our money that he stole, right? Now, the Afghanistan position apparently was anybody who wants to come in and take over our country, the door is wide open. We won't do anything about it. It's your nation if you want it, and we'll live under any edicts that you impose on us, right? But now compare that to Ukraine, where they're defending themselves against one of the world's largest and heavily equipped militaries. Their president didn't run. He's still standing there. He's had multiple offers to get out like de Gaulle did and govern in absentia, but he stays right in the middle of the whole thing. He is accepting all of the help that we're giving them in intelligence and small weapons that they can use to shoot down choppers, whirlybirds, and shoot tanks and so on. And they're putting up a hell of a fight and staving off the invasion. Now, the Taliban was little more than a ragtag army of a bunch of towelheads with AR-15s. The most sophisticated weaponry they had was a 50 caliber machine gun mounted in the back of a Toyota.
Freelance thugs.
Yeah. And yet the Afghan people didn't put up any resistance at all. I don't remember hearing a report of any of the Afghan military putting up any defense against them. They just let them walk in. And so that's why it turned so chaotic. I suppose you can argue that as commander-in-chief, even though he wasn't the commander of the Afghan military, Biden should have understood that this was going to happen. And then what would the solution have been? To leave troops there longer? Well, then that would have negated the withdrawal, wouldn't it? The withdrawal agreement, which was, we're leaving.
Well, again, the cliche is that Afghanistan is the place where empires go to die. All the way back to Alexander the Great.
The curious thing, though, is that Trump still has not condemned Putin for invading Ukraine. In fact, he still maintains he's a genius, even after he completely botched the invasion. I mean, the military intelligence asserts that the Russian forces would be in Kiev within 2 days. They'd round up Zelensky and his cabinet, take them all out and shoot them and install a puppet government. And Ukraine would have been under Russian control by the end of the week. And instead, what is it now, 8 weeks?
Yeah.
And they're still pushing back. In fact, even rebuilding the cities that have been hit.
And the last time that an invading force was able to overcome a native resistant force was the Boer War. And again, the Boers practiced a scorched earth policy in order to achieve that. the military events so far in Ukraine are, I mean, what do you compare it to? You know, when the British defeated the Spanish Armada, or when the Greeks held off the 20,000 invaders with just a few hundred men. I mean, it's some colossal historical events. This will go down right along with the Battle of Hastings and D-Day, and
Putin's really put himself in a hell of a tight position now, right? Do you have any prediction about how this is going to work out?
Well, Putin has the same problems that Donald Trump has in many ways.
Blaming Trump again.
No, I'm not.
All right, go ahead. Fine.
I'm not blaming Trump for Putin's problems, but Putin has committed a number of illegal acts during his term as president, and were he to resign or be deposed, he would be subject to prosecution for those, which is why, one of the reasons why he had the term limits overturned, the constitutional restriction on 3 terms. Secondly, a huge portion of his wealth is tied up in the government because the government owns it, but he controls it, housing and on and on and on, automobiles, airplanes. And another reason is that the Russian billionaires, he created most of those, or allowed them to happen, on the proviso that a large percentage of what their wealth became would be his. Or he would simply have them arrested and put in jail. So they could be a billionaire or they could be in prison, your choice. So if he's not in power and he no longer has all of the swag and political favors and influence to hand out to and to hold over the oligarchs, it's not unlikely that they would turn against him as well. So he needs to stay in power in order to stay out of prison, just like our former president. And for that reason, he will not go down without a fight. And by that, I mean whatever it takes, because I think the man is, like our former president, not fully in touch with the reality of things.
Dick Cheney was considered a war criminal for his invasion of Iraq, and as I understand
he couldn't go to Canada. Right.
They were going to pinch the guy and put him on trial. So he had to pretty much stay home. So it all depends on what perspective we're looking at things. Now, we all know Biden is responsible for the high cost of gasoline because he pulled the permit for the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. Although I heard somebody discussing that the other day, and they said that even if that permit had not been pulled and the construction would have proceeded, it still wouldn't be finished. It's such a long pipeline.
Well, besides, none of the fuel was intended for us. For the U.S., it was simply to get it from Canada down to where it could be shipped to other countries.
They'd refine it. So we'd get the poison, the fuel companies get the profit, and then the fuel gets shipped out.
And it's still being carried to wherever they wanted it to go. Not quite as efficiently, but certainly in massive quantities in what are called trucks.
That's right. I mean, we don't have a pipeline from Saudi Arabia. We're getting oil from them. There are other ways to transport oil, but I imagine that the oil companies aren't complaining too much about the high cost of oil. British Petroleum announced a $9 billion profit.
Record profits.
Previous quarter. Why don't they cut their profits a little bit so that it'll ease the price at the pump? Biden has no control over that, but he could. Oh, and by the way, I'll come back to that. Remember, conservatives were complaining 11,000 jobs could have been created by building that pipeline. Well, where are we today? We've had the strongest job growth in years.
Right.
In
Jobs
decades.
are going begging.
Yeah, there's 2 jobs for every person looking for one. So that excuse kind of fizzled out. So anyway, we had a law in this country that prohibited the exportation of oil. And that was actually reversed by the Trump administration. And so we started exporting oil when we had excess oil because of the pandemic. There simply weren't as many vehicles being driven or planes being flown or trucks being driven. And so that led to an excess of oil, and we exported it. It wasn't due to any brilliant policy of production controlled by the government. But then when we started to recover, the refineries are playing catch up, and the oil companies don't want the prices coming down because their profits are so exorbitant. But whether it's inflation or the price of oil, we could ration it, right? Like they did during the war, which they did, of course, to really conserve the rubber of the tires, not the fuel itself, but nevertheless, it worked.
We could set the speed limit back to a maximum of 55 miles an hour, which we did during the oil crisis back in the 20th century.
Yeah. And it's the same thing with inflation. Inflation isn't affecting just our country. It's affecting the whole world, which is because of complex things that happen all at pretty much at the same time. And the reaction to them.
Many of them connected to a disease over which no one has any control. Although I don't want to blame Trump, but there is a great deal of speculation that had he attacked it vigorously when it first surfaced or began to spread, that the number of infections and deaths and the length of the pandemic would have been much shorter and fewer. In fact, we just officially passed 1 million dead in this country.
We did. And the first cases are showing up now in North Korea.
Yeah.
And you know how tight that country's sealed.
Yeah.
Can't get in or out. Yeah, I doubt anybody could have actually prevented it from coming in, but we could have taken more vigorous action to try to
Right, and
prevent it
I've seen
from the beginning.
speculation that 50 to 60% of the dead and 50% to 60% of the infections could have been avoided had we taken vigorous action to stave off the problem from day one, instead of denying that it existed, or there were only a few cases, or that it would go away soon, or you just need to suck up a little bleach.
And of course, China's response is a severe crackdown, because they've got to control it over there, and they don't need to negotiate with the citizens, right? It's just tell you, this is what you're going to do, or we're going to haul you off to jail.
The thought is the deed.
So that, of course, affects the amount of goods that they can produce and send over here, which gives us shortages, which then leads to inflation. What could Biden do about that? He should be lifting the tariffs that the previous administration imposed, import tariffs, because that's nothing but a tax that the consumer pays.
Yeah, I can understand why he hasn't done that. I mean, that's really slow-witted.
But you remember Nixon addressed inflation with wage and price controls back in the 70s. In fact, I remember I was working in a company as a minimum wage worker. And so after I'd been there, 6 months or something, the boss wanted to give me a raise. He says, well, I can't give you a raise, but what I can do is change your job title so that you can get the raise that way. So employers had to be creative in ways to increase wages if they felt their
That's how we got the patchwork insurance system that we have now. During World War II, they put caps on salaries because there was such a demand for workers. Obviously, they were all in the Army. And in order to get around that, they began providing them with benefits, cars, and insurance, of all things. And so that sort of became a condition of employment in many cases. Do you offer insurance? Well, yes, we do. So from that sprang up the crappy insurance system that we have now.
And so the answer is, if we want to control inflation, we can let the government come in and implement wage and price controls and rationing, and that would stop it. If we want to, we can do it. But boy, can you imagine the outcry, right? Because all these free market people are going to say, no, we don't want that.
You've curbed my freedom to buy a mask.
Yeah. And of course, Biden isn't talking about doing that. All he's talking about is the forgiving the student loans. But that doesn't look very, really very promising to be passed. I think because he started out with full forgiveness. Now he's down to 10,000, and
I think
I just don't see
I'm
how
in
he's gonna get
favor of it, but only if it has a needs test.
Yeah.
I don't see why Patty Hearst should have her loan forgiven, just like, I don't know, some guy on the bench.
And, it's what free enterprise is all about. I saw a great letter in the paper today by a fellow from St. Pete. He says, I see where Governor DeSantis is designating November 7th as a day when Florida students should learn about the, quote, victims of communism, unquote. How about a course on victims of capitalism? Students can learn about worker exploitation, low wages, rent gouging, foreclosures, evictions, for-profit healthcare systems leading to overpriced or unaffordable healthcare, lack of support for families. All these are byproducts of our wonderful capitalistic system. And what I would add to that is he's left out the robber barons of the early 20th century, child labor that isn't protected in a free market, right? Mm-hmm. You've got to have government regulations to protect children. And of course, the Great Depression. Our system of pure capitalism, as pure as it was 90 years ago, led to a crushing depression, 25% unemployment, and it hung in for a decade.
And we think of it as the Great Depression because it's so recent in our memories and in our relatives and people still alive. But frankly, it was a pretty regular occurrence about every 20, 30, 50 years. Mm-hmm. The stock market would crash just like it's getting ready to do now.
Yeah. See, I took a course in high school called Problems of American Democracy. The teacher was a guy named Lou Filippello. And what he tried to explain is how these different systems evolved and why. So communism wasn't dreamed up to be some sort of a slave-infested gulag run by authoritarian dictators. It was a response to the disparity of wealth that he saw in these capitalist countries where the top 5% were the royalty and the upper class and controlled everything. And the workers who worked so hard for them lived on subsistence level wages.
Well, the earliest Christians, and in fact, the earliest societies were all communistic by nature. Mm-hmm. From each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs.
First tried right here in this country in Jamestown before it was a country. They damn near starved to death, right? Because nobody was putting anything in the warehouse. Everybody's taking everything out. And the next thing you know, it's empty.
Well, like any
they
other,
say, well, that's not working too well.
Yeah, like any other system, there's always complaints about, he's not holding up his end.
Yeah. But these words are considered just these inherent evils, but they weren't intended to be that. That and socialism, they always point to Venezuela and say, well, there's socialism for you, but conveniently neglect to point to China, which is a communist country whose economy is poised to surpass ours, if only because of the sheer numbers. There's so damn many people working there that they have a bigger economy, but they haven't flopped and failed and living in poverty.
And then neglect to point out that a large part of Venezuela's problems are due to the rapacity of American banks who bought their loans when oil prices fell and the oil market stagnated and then drove them to the wall.
And it was a nationalized oil system, right?
Company. And then drove them to the wall rather than show them any kind of flexibility.
And what we're seeing right here in our own country is when the government doesn't respond to the people and what they want, you can have bad government in any system, in any economic system. So now when approximately 70% of the people want to see a woman's right to make her own reproductive choices being overturned by the will of the minority, And we're being told, well, you just accept it even if you don't like it. That's part of living in this country. Unless the election doesn't turn out the way we like, and then we're going to raise hell about it.
All that's decided by a bunch of white men. A
Yeah.
great photo. I should have brought it with me. It's a bunch of dogs sitting around a table discussing where cats' reproductive rights ought to be.
Yeah. Well, you're listening to the Voice of Reason on the Tan Talk Radio Network, and coming right up after a very short break, our weekly Bible reading with Joe. And then the Voice of Reason will continue with more of the topics the conservatives never want you to hear about.
Caregivers find the support they need on Connecting Caregivers Radio with Linda Burhans, the gal who cares for the caregiver. Heard every Friday from 1 to 2 p.m., Linda and her caring and knowledgeable guests will bring you education, information, and resources, as well as a shoulder for caregivers. That's Connecting Caregivers Radio with Linda Burhans, the gal who cares for the caregiver, where you can find help and hope every Friday from 1 to 2 p.m. right here on the Tan Talk Radio Network.
Ain't it good? Are you a writer, inventor? Do you have questions about your intellectual property rights? Well, tune in every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 11 o'clock for Joy on Paper. Once a month, I will have a special guest, the writer's legal eagle, Bill Larson of Larson & Larson, who can answer your questions. Protect your valuable work. Email me your questions to patsy.radio@gmail.com and then listen in every Tuesday and Thursday at 11 a.m. right here on Tampa Bay's Tan Talk Radio Network. That's patsy.radio@gmail.com.
Don't turn it off now. You need this stuff. Tampa Bay's Tan Talk Radio Network.
And if you care to comment on the program, we'd welcome an email from you at WTANvoice@AOL.com. That's WTANvoice@AOL.com. We'll be glad to answer anything you'd like to throw at us, unless it's sticking, of course. Okay, Joe. Ready for your weekly Bible quote?
Well, great, because I happen to have one handy. And as usual, I'm keeping with the topics of the day, food shortages, baby formula shortages. I have a little Bible verse, which is helpful for those of you who want to make ends meet, M-E-A-T. And it's from the fourth chapter of Ezekiel, the 15th verse, where God says unto Ezekiel, "Then he said unto me, Lo, I have given thee cow's dung for man's dung, and thou shalt prepare thy bread therewith." So there's one way to, sort of spread the food around a little more, and I'm sure it works at least as well as Hamburger Helper. And it allows me, of course, to quote Voltaire, who said, "Anyone who admires Ezekiel should be compelled to dine with him."
Thank you, Joe.
Sure.
Well, topical and up to date. Now, Stephanie Miller is a broadcaster on Free Speech TV. Her father was Barry Goldwater's running mate in the 1964 presidential contest. His name was William Miller. He was a Republican. Free Speech TV is liberal propaganda, okay? And she's on that system now, so she converted over. She's also a lesbian. Now, the other day I was listening to her, and she says part of their campaign theme was this line, quote, "Government has one hand in your pocket and the other in your business," unquote, right? Meaning the Republican Party represented less government intrusion, both through taxation and by trying to control our personal lives too. But now look, here's the GOP invading our businesses in the most intimate way possible by probably eliminating Roe versus Wade and forcing women to bear children they don't want. Essentially, the government's taking control of every womb in America. And what's Rip-Off Rick doing? Rick Scott, he wants to tax the poorest of the poor who already are working for below subsistence wages, right? Subsistence level wages, I should say. And so the party has evolved into exactly what they were complaining about back in 64. So when this Supreme Court draft was leaked, what was it, Monday, I believe, wasn't it? The GOP focused on the leak instead of the elimination of the civil liberties over half the population of this nation. And I presume that they're eventually going to seek to ban abortion nationwide by passing a federal law declaring personhood of a zygote, right? And then even the blue states won't be allowed to engage in that. So now if you ask me, and nobody did, but I'll tell you anyway, I think the leaker is kind of a current day Edward Snowden. He's exposing the rotten. Yeah. He's kind of a modern day Paul Revere warning of the coming invasion of the anti-American, anti-Constitution forces that are going to take our liberties in the sole interest of expanding their own minority rule. And I see religious oppression replacing our constitutional liberties because that's the foundation of these decisions. Christianity is as oppressive as any religion that's practiced in the world today. It's a very oppressive religion, but it isn't taught that way in this country. Right? It's taught that it's this religion of peace and love and harmony and compassion, everything good, but it isn't that at all, right? Because it oppresses women, and that's the foundation of the SCOTUS decision.
Well, basically, it teaches us that it's desirable to punish people for all eternity over what amounts to a difference of opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's why I always carry a baseball bat.
But that's why women couldn't vote in this country or own property or enter professions. They couldn't get higher education because the whole concept of womanhood in Christianity is she is there to be a helpmeet to the husband. She is subservient to the husband. She will honor and obey the husband.
Plus, it's the fault of womanhood that we have evil in the world, from Adam and Eve to Pandora's box, and on and on. So it's not just that they're subservient to men, it's that they're the cause of all our troubles as well.
But as we see, the conservatives tend to, well, shall we say, engage in alternative facts more often than not, as we look back at the Senate confirmation hearings of the judges that are voting to overturn Roe. Okay. And they all lied under oath when they were questioned about their stand on Roe versus Wade decision. They all stated it was established law that they wouldn't try to overturn. So shouldn't they all be impeached for having lied under oath? These are the top judges in the country that have no respect for taking an oath, and they end up perjuring themselves.
But they're all openly religious as well.
Mm-hmm. So let's listen to the words of the justices when asked about their positions on the appraisal of Roe. We're going to hear in this order: Clarence the Masher Thomas, Samuel Alito, Gorsuch, rapist Kavanaugh. Then Senator Susan Collins weighs in with her appraisal of Kavanaugh. And finally, handmaiden Amy.
I believe the Constitution protects the right to privacy, and I have no reason or agenda to prejudge the issue.
Roe versus Wade is an important precedent of the Supreme Court. It was decided in 1973. It has been challenged on a number of occasions, and the Supreme Court has reaffirmed the decision. When a decision is challenged and it is reaffirmed, that strengthens its value.
Roe versus Wade, decided in 1973, is a precedent of the United States Supreme Court. It has been reaffirmed, so a good judge will consider it as precedent of the United States Supreme Court, worthy as treatment of precedent like any other.
As a judge, it is an important precedent of the Supreme Court. By it, I mean Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Been reaffirmed many times. Casey is precedent on precedent.
I do not believe that Brett Kavanaugh will overturn.
Precedents are
Roe v.
overturned all the time.
They aren't overturned all the time. He views precedent not just as a legal doctrine, but as rooted in our Constitution.
Neil Gorsuch, for whom you voted.
we didn't get Handmaiden Amy in there, but she said the same thing essentially. And that was Collins talking about how Kavanaugh would uphold it. And she had no concern about him overturning Roe.
Well, if you repeat a lie often enough, as we know, you are what is called a Republican.
It's true.
So they're already schooled in, and again, I'd have to look up the exact verses, but the Bible condones, in fact, suggests that lying for Jesus is perfectly okay.
Wow. Well, they tell us just go ahead and resolve this at the ballot box if the majority of us want that freedom and the right to control our own reproductive decisions. But how are we going to do that when the districts are all gerrymandered so that we can't get a fair election? And the Electoral College allows the loser to win sometimes. So that's not democracy. Here we are, beating our breast and trumpeting how we're the shining city on the hill, spreading democracy all over the world. We don't have it here. And we have a governor who is still engaging in Jim Crow laws, keeping people from voting. And we're seeing what's happening in all these different states now, 19 states that are going to attempt to rig the midterm elections this year. Republicans who still insist that the 2020 election was stolen aren't really trying to undo those results. Their real objective is to execute successfully in 2024 the very same plan they failed in executing 2 years ago if Trump or his anointed successor loses again. Their radical plan's cornerstone is the little-known independent state legislature theory, which argues that under the Constitution, state legislatures possess sole power to decide which slate of electors to send to the Electoral College. Even if legislatures choose the losing candidate's electors on some bogus premise, state courts and state election officials cannot intervene. So you can see what's coming here. Now, that was the idea that was floated after Trump lost, but state officials and Mike Pence refused to go along. But since then, Republicans have worked to elect Trumpists to state legislatures and election boards in key swing states. Republicans also hope to get their independent state legislature doctrine approved by the Supreme Court, with 3 of its hard-right justices having already endorsed it. Beware, Joe, the GOP is poised to steal from Democrats the presidential election in 2024 that they falsely claim the Democrats stole from them in 2020.
Well, if all of these ideas were so popular and so democratic that no one would object, but the giveaway is the minute that they ban litigation, they're admitting that these have some serious problems ethically, morally, and constitutionally, but we don't want anyone to be able to decide that other than ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
It's like when Enron said, well, you can't sell your stock while the executives were busily selling theirs. It's an admission of defeat.
That was a hell of a deal, wasn't it? You go to work for Enron, they pay you, and then make you give some of it back buying their stock, which then becomes worthless.
Right.
We don't need no stinking regulations. We can always trust corporations, can't we?
Were we saying something about the evils of capitalism just a few minutes ago?
And, it's not to say that we are not capitalists.
No, I'm not opposed to capitalism. I'm opposed to rapacity.
And we use a lot of socialist systems in our system very effectively. It doesn't need to be treated as some kind of poison that we need to avoid at all costs. And the ideal is to take the best of all the systems and use them to our advantage, and not be so afraid of a term just because it sounds like it's some kind of a hostile system. The thing that bothers me, though, is the arrogance of these religionists who assume that their beliefs are factual, mainly because they have the beliefs, and only because they have those beliefs, and they want to oppress all of us with their beliefs, and they're using their beliefs instead of the Constitution now to actually establish law that we all need to live under.
Faith, particularly blind faith or unlimited faith, is not a virtue. It is a vice.
Yes.
It is immoral. It is morally, ethically wrong for any person anywhere at all time and in all places to believe a thing without adequate proof.
They try to tell us that the founding principles of the country were Judeo-Christian values. Well, if that was true, we'd be a kingdom. And that's exactly the kind of values that the founding fathers were getting away from because they saw that kingdoms weren't working. Right? And so they created a constitution. Why would you do that if you thought all of the laws for how we should live are already defined in your religion manual, right? They wouldn't do it.
No, the only references to religion anywhere in the Constitution are prohibitions.
Precisely.
No religious test and no laws prohibiting or
establishing
religions.
Or prohibiting your exercise of it, meaning you believe whatever you want or nothing at all. So while they try to paint communism as some kind of godless atheist institution, the fact of the matter is we have a totally secular constitution in this country.
And even where religion is, of course, 100% permitted, there are restrictions. Human sacrifice, for instance, is frowned on by the more carnal amongst us. I like to point out that the Incas used to strangle newborn infants because their tears were pleasing to the rain gods. I don't see what's wrong with that. And of course, I have also mentioned Priapus. For those of you who want to tell other people's wives what to do with their reproductive systems, certainly you ought to be willing to extend the same right to them regarding your wife's reproductive systems.
But this is the hypocrisy of this Supreme Court draft, is they're saying that this abortion issue is not literally addressed in the Constitution, so therefore it's not a guaranteed right, and they can decide whether you get it or not. But civil rights aren't defined in the Constitution, are they? They don't spell
What
it.
right is more sacrosanct than your own body? Who is the captain of your soul?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so the fundamental decisions that the courts have made with respect to the meaning of the Constitution, since these cases have started being brought with respect to individual liberties, which didn't really come about until the mid-1930s, were that the Constitution protects the liberties and freedoms of all Americans by virtue of being an American, not based on what state somebody lives in. And so, that's the precedent of the court standing with regard to our rights. They don't need to spell out every right in the Constitution. They need to uphold the rights that we should all have, and not be just using their position of power to impose their religious ideology on us. And now, it's being disclosed that what Trump wanted to do was actually shoot the protesters, right? And I said,
in the legs, please, but let's be fair.
Well, I bring this up because of the complaints that the conservatives have against protesters standing in front of the residences of the judges, exercising their freedom to redress the government and protest, a fundamental freedom in the country that is spelled out in the Constitution.
Andy Borowitz column just today pointed out that Kavanaugh, and I think rightfully so, was very distressed because the protesters were interfering with his keg deliveries.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and annoying him when he wakes up on the weekend with those hangovers.
Yeah,
Come
it's just
on,
not
people.
right. People chanting.
Well, Mark Esper was the Secretary of Defense for the final 18 months of the previous administration, and he's been making the cable news rounds now, hyping his memoir, which is called A Sacred Oath. Oath by government officials is to the Constitution and not to any political party or political figure, okay? He discloses how disconnected to the Constitution Trump was while in office. And he says this, he says, remember that day that Trump walked across the ellipse to the to the burned out church to demonstrate his allegiance to, actually, he didn't say this, I'm saying this, but he wanted to demonstrate his allegiance to Christianity by holding a Bible upside down. Well, the peaceful protesters were occupying the street in front of the church, and they were in Trump's way. So you're not going to believe how he proposed to resolve this issue, as explained by Esper in an interview that aired last week on 60 Minutes.
What specifically was he suggesting that the U.S. military should do to these protesters?
He says, can't you just shoot them? Just shoot them in the legs or something. And he's suggesting that that's what we should do, that we should bring in the troops and shoot the protesters.
The commander-in-chief was suggesting that the U.S. military shoot protesters.
Yes, in the streets of our nation's capital. That's right.
There's respect for the Constitution. Isn't that unbelievable? What next, right? I know
commander-in-chief.
What next would have been martial law,
sure,
right? And just say no protesting allowed. Gee, where do we see that in the world, Joe?
Dictator land?
Yeah. And so this is why I think that if he ever gets back in office, it's going to be the end of the republic as we know it. Because
the only thing he has that resembles a platform is his vow to take revenge upon anybody who slighted him, real or imagined, ever since he entered the public ever since he came down the escalator. And he has a list.
Yeah, it's just inconceivable to me that anybody would vote for somebody who has so much disrespect for the people of this country and the Constitution that's there to protect them. That's why he fired Comey, right? He wanted Comey to express loyalty to him instead of the Constitution. Mm. And Comey, just like Esper, understood that no, as a government official, my oath is to the Constitution and not to any politician, which means if you commit a crime, I'm going to investigate it and prosecute you. Well, Trump says then you have no place in office. He only wants loyalists in office and in his administration.
Loyalist is a kind of a modest term for what he wants.
Right.
But as the children might be listening, I don't think we can really say.
But the worst part is the fact that the Republicans in the Senate, almost all of them, are indifferent to this. Yeah. They're perfectly willing to look the other way so that they can stay in power. I mean, they had two opportunities to impeach him. He was guilty on both counts. A couple other things he did, they didn't even prosecute him for, right? The Hatch Act and the Emoluments Act that he violated with regularity.
They don't seem to notice that they're degrading themselves.
I know. And it is why the Republican Party is now just simply a crime syndicate posing as a political party. I mean, they're the party of crime, hypocrisy, and corruption. And they want to take over the country. And if they get their hands on it again, they're not going to let go. They're going to rig the election system so that they can never be thrown out of office. And if it becomes a one-party system, or if they have so much of a majority that it's effectively a one-party system, well, isn't that what we shun in these other countries like Russia and Cuba and Iran, Saudi Arabia, and North Korea? Yeah.
Sometimes the medicine is bitter, Ed, but you have to swallow it in order to get well, in order to be great again. Excuse me.
So my last question to you today is, do you think that the voters, and especially the unaffiliated voters, are going to get riled up enough by what they see going on in the Supreme Court to actually turn this supposed tide of Republican takeover of Congress the other direction and keep them out?
I think it will help, but I think if the voting foibles that the Republicans, it's hard to tell them apart.
Understandable slip.
That the Republicans
are
implementing, the turnout may have little bearing on who actually wins the election. Mm-hmm. If the elections are conducted and counted fairly, I still don't think it's going to be sufficient. There's just too many people, who literally or figuratively are flying the Go Brandon signs in their minds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and once we lose our liberties,
they ain't coming back.
Exactly right. They're not coming back unless maybe we divide as a nation. I know there's a lot of talk about that. I shouldn't say a lot, but there are people giving consideration to that as the only way to save the liberties for at least the people that are in the blue states or in the blue column. And it could come to either that or revolution. That's what's happened before in the world, and we aren't immune from it here.
We're hearing rumblings of that from both sides. If the Democrats actually do win, then it's prima facie that the election has been stolen and crimes are committed, which, of course, is a call to arms.
Our quote today from George Bernard Shaw, who said, "Democracy is a device that ensures we shall be governed no better than we deserve." Hope to join us again next Thursday on The Voice of Reason, along with Joe Reinhardt. Ed Golly reminding you, if the statement seems a little too implausible to be true, don't believe it just because a conservative said it.
Laugh at them.
WTAN, Clearwater.
FM 106.1.
WDCF, Dade City.
FM 102.3.
WZHR, Zephyr Hills.
FM 104.3.
Listen.
CBS News on the Hour, your home for original reporting.
I'm Steve Kathan, President